He turned to Lindy. "Tell me what you see in the hedgerow there, Lindy. Do you see anything beyond the opening in the branches? Can you see how their shadow on the grass makes it look as though there's a path in there, and then it might lead somewhere exciting?" Lindy looked at the hedge carefully and concentrated hard. The light and the shadow played strange tricks on her eyes. There was a shimmering quality to the afternoon, and her head felt a little dizzy. It seemed as though the hedge began to move, to twist into a different shape, like a tunnel. She leaned forward, mesmerized. For 1 second she was convinced that if she could just go through the tunnel, she would come out into a new and unknown land. She was so excited that she looked up at the professor to tell him about it, and as she did, the spell was broken. "What is it, Lindy?" The professor watched her keenly. Lindy turned to look at the hedge once again. She frowned because the illusion wasn't there anymore. All she could see was the green hedge in a perfectly plain winter garden. "That's funny," she said. "I thought that—" She stopped, aware that the boys were staring at her. "Well, it's not important, I guess. I let my imagination run away with me for a moment." Professor Savant looked at her thoughtfully. Then he turned and walked onto the lawn. "Come on over and look over here," he called. "I want to show you something." The children followed him. He moved to a small clump of chrysanthemums that Lindy had pointed out earlier. He picked a beautiful white one on a thick green stem. "Look at this. See how sturdy it is? A flower that blooms this close to winter has to be strong." He handed it to Lindy. Ben shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "I like flowers, but I think they're a bit sissy for a boy." The professor moved to Sneezewort and picked him up. "Let's go inside, and I'll show you something that just might change your mind, young man. Have you started science in school yet?" "We began last semester, sir." "Good. Bring that flower with you, Lindy," he commanded, and walked briskly into the warm house. The children followed him as they climbed 3 flights of stairs into a small white door. "I'll have you know," he said as he unlocked it, "that I allow very few people in here, very few indeed." He stepped aside to let them through. They gasped when they saw the room. Ben felt as if he had stepped into a small paradise. "Look at the telescope," he said. "What are all those lights?" Tom asked. "That's the model of the problem I've been working on." The professor moved over to it. "It's made of special fiber optic glass, which allows the light to shine through it in such an interesting way. It's good, isn't it?" "It sure is." Tom sounded almost reverent. The professor took the cover off the large microscope. "This is what I wanted to show you, Ben. This is called a binocular microscope because you look through it with both eyes. Give me that flower, Lindy." She handed him the chrysanthemum. The professor carefully removed a single white petal and placed it under the lens. "Look in here now," he said. "This should make flowers look more interesting." The children took turns, and each saw something that resembled an aerial photograph of a river and many streams feeding into it, a latticework of tiny interconnecting tubes. "Those veins and tubes carry energy to the cells of the petal," the professor explained. "See what happens if you drop a little ink on the stem of the petal? See how the blue circulates through every little vein? That's just how blood circulates in your body." Lindy made a face. "I don't like blood. It's gross." "Well, that's a silly remark. Blood carries nutrition and energy and food to every part of your body. So instead of being gross, you should be saying, 'How wonderful!'" The professor turned to the boys. "I want to make a point, and I want you to learn it well," he said. "I know that there are times that things seem rather boring to you and not worth your interest, like that flower today. Once you notice its color and the fact that it's growing, you dismiss it. It is sissy. A magnificent creation like a flower is definitely not sissy. When I showed you that flower under the microscope, you learned that there was a whole new dimension to it. What is a dimension? Lindy asked. In this case, it means going one step beyond what you already see and know, finding another world, that one that has been there all along, just waiting for you to discover it. Like Whangdoodles, she said. Is this a dimension? Is that a dimension? In a way, yes, said the professor. My point is this. I don't want you to ever again take something at face value, to take things for granted. Let your curiosity run away with you. Know that beyond every ordinary explanation there is a deeper and more exciting discovery to be made. There was a knock on the door and Mrs. Primrose entered. Tea is ready, sir. Fine, said the professor. Then that will end our lesson for today. Tomorrow we will be going on to a picnic, so bring your bicycles. And soon, also, you should dress in weatherproof clothes because it is going to rain. How on earth do you know that? Tom asked. The professor rumpled the boy's hair. I'm a scientist, Thomas, and I also heard the weather forecast on the radio. They all laughed and clattered downstairs to tea. That evening the children were elated. Lindy especially was keyed up. Her powers of concentration had been put to good use that afternoon. By dinner time she was so excited she was almost unable to eat. Mrs. Potter tried not to show concern. Lindy, dear, don't just stare at your plate. Eat your stew and dumplings. It's not stew, and they're not dumplings, Lindy answered. It's a brown land with mountains, and the dumplings are sponges, white sponges, that will suck you up if you get near them. What is this? What are you talking about? Mr. Potter gave his daughter a keen glance. No, not sponges, Lindy changed her mind. They are giant boulders, and I wish I were small enough to climb in one. Mrs. Potter said, I think this afternoon has been a little too much for you. You're being very silly. It's not silly, Mom. Tom came to Lindy's defense. Look at the peas in my plate. Don't they look like tiny green stones, like when you eat at a seaside and the beach is all pebbles? They look like peas to me, replied Mrs. Potter. I think you all need an early night. As Lindy was preparing for bed, Tom knocked on the door of her room. Lindy, can I come in? What is it, Tom? Here's the quarter I owe you. He put it on her bedside table. Lindy examined the 25-cent piece. Thanks. But you don't really need to give this to me. Do you want it back? Tom was surprised, and he thought about it for a moment. No, he said. You want it fairly, and besides, if you hadn't gone to Stonehouse, we'd never have met the professor. She smiled at him. Tell you what, I won't even spend it. I'll just keep it to remind me of Halloween. It'll be my lucky piece from now on. In a rare show of affection for his sister, Tom patted her on the shoulder. Okay. Well, good night. Good night, Tom. Lindy slowly removed her slippers and bathrobe. She pulled her curtains and brushed her teeth, and then climbed into her comfortable brass bed. She lay back against the pillows and thought about the afternoon and how wonderful it had been. She thought about the professor and Sneezewort and the incredible microscope. Soon she began to drift to sleep. Through half-closed eyes she gazed at the curtains pulled across her windows. They were pretty curtains, printed with flowers of the countryside, red and orange poppies, white and yellow daisies, blue cornflowers. Lindy thought, as she did often, how nice it would be to walk in a field of flowers like that. The curtains moved very slightly. She stretched out hard to touch the flowers, which seemed almost within her grasp. When Mrs. Potter came upstairs to say good night to her daughter, she found her already asleep, smiling peacefully, with one hand open on the coverlet. That is the end of chapter 5, part 1.